Self is the organism. May 30th, 2008. Date: the 30th of May 2008. Self is the origin, the source of this reality and how it exists. Meaning that it is the very existence of self, the very beingness and nature of self as who I accept and allow me to be that manifest this reality and how it exists. It's not a point separate from self that is the problem. As I said, self is the points as all origins as all sources. For example, one can blame anger as the reason why I am the way I am and experience me to be. The point being blamed in separation of self in this example is anger. Instead of realizing that this anger experienced within exists through self's permission, wherein the anger in itself is self, because it exists and is experienced by self. Therefore, the point isn't anger in itself, it's anger as self. Wherein, the point isn't anger, the point is self. Anger is generated through participation therein, and if you experience anger, you become it, you are it. Therefore, the blame cannot be placed in anger itself, it is to realize that I am accepting and allowing this anger to exist through my permission within participating within anger. Therefore, I have to take self-responsibility for me equals and stop. And so it is with all and everything experienced within self. You are what you accept and allow you to participate within and experience as yourself. If you are unable to portal, it would mean you have not sourced all points in existence as self, that you have not identified the points within and as you that has created you to be how and who you are in this moment here and experience you to be, but still exist within separation with you, yourself. That means, there exist points in your existence which has formed a relationship in separation with another existence, source, origin. Because, within the very separation of you from a particular point, or a relationship is formed and a relationship exists between two separate points connected with a line, the line symbolizing relationship. This creates the illusion of here and there and manifests a holographic perceptual identity that exists currently as consciousness. Consciousness being the manifested projected self, the other source, origin with which a relationship is formed in separation, manifesting a holographic perceptual identity of and as self. Because what occurs within separation is that which you have separated yourself from becomes more than you, and as some within this process has already realized, the mind as consciousness controls you and the mind contain, as the very manifested existence of the mind, all points of self has separated self from. Each point that is not self as origin will manifest as an energetic holographic grid line, which will be experienced as either a picture perception, an emotional perception or a feeling perception. So each point you have separated yourself from, manifest a point connected to you with a line as relationship, and wherein, all points from which you've separated you from, manifest the grid line structure manifestation as that which the mind of consciousness exists as and consist of, forming and shaping the holographic presentation you perceive you to be as who I am in this reality, through the mind. With the perceiver being the receiver of a charge of energy that is interpreted by the mind through the five senses and the sixth senses. Meaning that the experience of you through the mind is but a perception because within experiencing you in separation of you through the mind, you're only perceiving yourself, because how can you experience the actuality of you if you exist in separation of you? You cannot, therefore you become the perceiver receiving for instance a charge of energy, because you now exist in reaction, a separate source or origin acting for you. The receiving of a charge of energy as for instance love, which is then experienced through the mind, by you, interpreted through the mind through the five senses and sixth sense as the geometrical construct through which the mind exists within and as the physical human body, to make sense of or understand the experience within. The five senses form the pentagram grid line structure of consciousness, of physicality. The five senses as smell, touch, sight, hearing and taste form the geometrical construct through which the mind interprets this reality through the human physical body. The sixth point grid line, the hexagram, form the flower of life grid line structure of higher consciousness, within which the being perceive themselves as now in physicality and the origin being the higher self or divinity a source, being of the higher consciousness grid line system as there, as unified field, to be accessed through a process of lifting the energy, of raising consciousness, a so-called inner journey. An example of separating self from a point, forming a two-point relationship gridline as part of the entire gridline structure within and as which the mind exists, where self is here, in the now of unified field, as one point within and as the physical human body and the separate part of self is there as the other point outside separate from self within the unified field of this reality, manifesting the separation of here and there. Within the example where self has separated self from a higher self /source /divinity, this part of self is there, to be attained which manifest a journey towards a point, through practices as for instance lifting energy / raising consciousness. The sixth-point grid line specifically pertain to the sixth point being a higher source or origin than self, existing as a separate point as part of self, there, outside separate from self, perceived to be greater than / more than self here within and as the physical human body. This inner journey is simply a journey from a 5-pointed gridline structure to a 6, a 7, 8, and so on, pointed gridline structure. What is really happening is that the being is shifting perception from one dimension to another dimension of the same thing by changing her perception about the reality the mind is looking at, because self is looking through the mind at reality. For example, a being exists throughout their lives within and as the 5-point gridline structure, perceiving their reality through the mind through the experience of themselves within the 5 senses of physicality only. Then an event occurs, which causes them to shift from the 5-point gridline structure to the 6-point gridline structure, which is merely them shifting perception, through perceiving there to be something more greater than themselves there within the unified field of this reality, pertaining to an event that had taken place. Though all that occurs is the being shifting perception within themselves through the mind, and within the shifting, they move from one dimension to another within themselves of the mind. So by a mere shift of perception from one dimension as the 5-pointed gridline structure to another dimensions as the 6-point gridline structure as the geometrical structures within which the mind exists and consist of, the being's entire interpretation of themselves through the mind change, and so also their perception of themselves and their reality, yet still remain within perception of themselves through the mind. Self perceives information self receives according to the knowledge self has accepted to be her truth. But self being the creator, yet unrealized, as self creates in the very perception of reality according to the knowledge of self as accepted by self, the gridline reality of a consciousness field based on the knowledge and belief of self. So according to your self-definition through the mind based in knowledge, the information you receive you will filter through the mind, and therefore, you will merely perceive information received, because you're not one with and equal to the information received. But the information received is first filtered through your self-defined existence of the mind consisting of knowledge of who I am. Wherein, the unified field as the gridline reality of consciousness is based on how self perceives self within and without, through the mind, because through perceiving, the very act of perceiving, or you create. You create you and your reality through perception, perceiving information received based on the knowledge of self as accepted by self through the mind. The question then obviously is, how can billions of beings create their own perceptual reality, without it immediately affecting each other? That lies within the building block geometry of the trinity of space and time and self. Thus self, accept self to be at a certain space, at a specific time as a specific pre-accepted, preconditioned self. Meaning that each being within reality, within the grid line of the unified field, according to their accepted self-defined existence through the mind, are allocated always at a certain space within the grid line of the unified field, at a specific time within the grid line of the unified field as a specific pre-accepted, preconditioned self according to how self has defined self in relationship to this reality as the unified field through the mind. Self then as creator, projects into space and time the information and knowledge self has accepted about self. The projection of self manifest within the time-space construct of now of the unified field as past, present, and future, where beings create their reality through projecting their past, from the present within which they exist of the mind, into the future and so manifest their realities accordingly, and their experience within it. And remain enslaved to the unified field of now, by existing within the time-space construct of past, present, and future. This brings about multiple groups, multiple different forms and shapes of physicality, multiple different languages. And as all these self-projected realities of each other collide, the friction that is generated is then interpreted by the mind-consciousness system as the accepted knowledge and information structure as personality, which is now the mirror of self, the projected self in reverse. The collision that manifest friction within the unified field manifest when being self-projected realities doesn't synchronize, when being self-projected realities as personality of mind experience conflict, this the accepted and allowed way of life as self-projected realities as personality of mind exist in constant, continuous collision, manifesting friction. This friction through which the mind and the unified field of the mind as consciousness moves and exists. And the self-defined personality of mind become the mirror of self. That means an attempted projection of self as polarity that actually ended up, instead of the opposite, it ended up in an alternate reverse of consciousness called limitation, within which self now exists as a projection. And so beings limit themselves by existing within the time-space construct of past, present, and future as now of the unified field, where self only exists as a projection of self, constantly projecting self, from the present frame of mind, into the future from the past. And so self becomes but a mere projection, limited to the experienced self's reality which has become the mirror of the projection of self. Attempting to find self, but seeing in the self-perception of here and there only the reverse of self, unable to return to origin or self. Because self is scattered within the space-time construct, existing within the past, the present, and the future, only experiencing the mirror of self's projection within this reality. Not realizing that self is here in timelessness. The return to self of the origin of self is obvious common sense. No return is possible, because self is already here. Self simply stop as perceiver and receiver through the accepted knowledge system defined as the mind, and the perceptual illusion implodes as it does at death anyway. Therefore, it is to stop existing within the mind, as the definition of self of knowledge of mind, because herein, one stop existing as a being that merely perceives reality through the mind based on the knowledge self has accepted self to be and become and exist as. Within this, the perceptual illusion of self implodes, because one no more perceives reality through the mind, one no more perceives self through the mind. All that remain is self here, one and equal with and as self, existing as self, no more as a perceiver through the mind in separation of self. Thus, in a way, self as the illusion dies and self is here, still in the physical, which is self-manifested. And realize, within stopping existing through the mind as a mere perceiver, creating reality within and without through the act of perceiving, that you are still here within and as the physical human body as you. Obviously, a few problems will remain. All manifested separate identities of self must stop. The manifested separate identities of self as all that exist within and as this physical manifested universe. Time only exists as a perception of self, thus time must stop as a perceived illusionary reality. And space must stop as the perceived defined knowledge-based reality that exists as self. Because time and space exist within and as the grid-line structure design of the unified field of consciousness of mind, limiting man to a system that run by itself within the manifested perceived movement as space and time. Space and time is the limitation accepted by and through self through the mind. Time and space actually stops at death. And thus an indication that space and time is a form, a manifestation of a system, for anything that ceases to exist at death is indicative to a system, because a system dies and ceases to exist. The grid-line field of existence is currently directed through Law's self has designed to try and minimize the friction in all the separate identities self has become. The minimization of friction between all the separate identities of self has been manifested through laws designed through the mind by self, because imagine for a moment if every thought of each being within this reality of the unified consciousness field were to manifest instantaneously in the moment of conception. Therefore, an example of a law designed by self through the mind to minimize friction is space and time, where on occasion only certain thoughts manifest through a period of years, space and time, where self cannot even remember that self actually created events experienced now from a thought that had manifested within your mind a few years back. Another example of the minimization of friction. All the separate identities that exist as self is all equal in creative ability, to be better off than another self. One identity must deceive another identity to get the power or creative ability to support one. C. All is equal in creative ability, a creative power, to minimize friction between all. Power among many is divided, whereby only certain beings absorb power to have more than others through manipulation as deception. This power is absorbed from others that give their power away to those that gain power, through the inferiority or superiority polarity system power play of the mind, manifesting within the unified consciousness field. The system balancing itself out within the polarity of inferiority and superiority, maintaining so a perception of stability, where some have more than others. How is this done? The base structure is the family structure, which is based on the identity called surname, and the principle of blood is thicker than water, within which the patriarch of the family will get the support of all the family members, to be the power, the leader, the law of the particular family system. C. An example of where and how the polarity system power play of inferiority and superiority originate, where the rest of the family members exist within inferiority towards the one they give their power away to, the patriarch of the family, which in most cases is the father figure. And within this, the father will be the superior, the power, the control, over and of the rest of the family, maintaining the perception of stability, through manipulation as deception, manipulation through fear for example, within which the rest of the family accept their position of being less than, and the father being more. So those that are inferior remain in their place, their inferiority-defined existence, they know their place so to speak, while those that are superior are given the power and attain the power through manipulation as deception to be and remain within their position of superiority. With the collapse of the family system, all separate identities has evolved, where evolution has been defined as the ability to find another way to manage the friction between the separate identity creators to be able to coexist as pieces of self. To obtain this, one structure is replaced by another, which happens through the principle of opportunity called the law of attraction. So, because of the collapse of the family system, the polarity of inferiority and superiority maintaining the perception of stability within the unified field within the family structure is compromised, and thus another structure steps forth which replaces the family structure. The family structure which was the primary point from which the unified field maintained stability through the inferiority-superiority polarity system. The law of attraction, for example, steps forth, where those that participate take and have more than others, absorbing power as money from others within this world and become the superior within the unified field, and those from which are taken become their inferior, and so the unified field of polarity balance itself. Thus, how did the whole family structure now evolve? The primary principle is energy, which has found its home of family as religion, and those that oppose this have found their home of family in the corporation. Because religion becomes the superior within the being's life, whereby beings give their power away through separation to religion and become the inferior. The same with corporations, where the corporation becomes the superior within the being's world, the being accepting an existence of inferiority towards that which is perceived to be greater than self, living for religion, a living for the corporation. The corporation has become the one family of man, being managed by the one accepted energy called money to reduce the friction where necessary through the rules of economy equals economy. Friction is reduced through beings following and existing within the laws of money as economy, ruled and regulated and controlled to remain in place within the unified field through abiding by the law of that which has become the quintessence of their survival, money, and the law itself being economy. Money through the system of economy, the superior and self the inferior, always indebted to that which brings them life as shelter, food, and clothes. The ultimate system where no self is allowed, but only the system is allowed. Because all that you are within the system is the amount of money you have, you are defined by and through the amount of money you have, classified according to the amount of money you have, categorized into sections of class. In this, the system has evolved the ultimate laws of consciousness that holds all the separate identities of the creative entities of the system of.